This show is going to be at the Met. It actually opened this past Tuesday, and it's going to be there until June 16th. It's not a gigantic show. It's got 50 pieces in it. Some of them are large scale, so it could take some walking to get through it. Um, so a lot of what I'm going to focus on today is Annie Albers. She is a basically a pioneer in contemporary weaving. Um, she um, really started a movement. I'm going to talk about the Bauhaus quite a bit because she and Joseph Albers started at the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was functioning from 1920 to 1933. And so they were both students at the Bauhaus and then went on to teach there. All right. So the process of creating textiles has been has been a source of creative invention. The nature of weaving is a grid formed by the vertical and horizontal elements of the loom, prompting the exploration of geometric designs. Annie Albers essentially um, repositioned weaving from a craft to what she called pictorial weaving. In other words, she brought it from being uh, a dismissed craft to being art. Um, Really, she called them pictorial weavings, meant to be viewed as a work of art on the wall rather than as clothing or floor covering or whatever uh, diminutive position it took in our culture. Uh, so, embracing the grid, the power of variation and innovation within limits. Um, the Andean geometric and figurative designs were endlessly fascinating and inspirational resources for Annie Albers. She saw um, in them a woven language, and in fact, the the Incas did not have a written language, but the evolution of their weaving really did have a pictorial language in it, embedded in it. Um, the There is a great legacy of the textiles from the Andean Inca and basically Peru and uh, a few of the other countries in that area. The Mayan and Mesoamerican um, cultures did do weavings and did use pattern in their cloth and things like that. But being in tropical climates, they didn't last. So the Chilean and Peruvian um, um, cloths lasted better because of the environment that they were in. They were in colder climates, so they lasted. Um, so in 1920s, when uh, Annie was attending the Bauhaus, there was a big collection of these cloths, these tunics and burial cloths and things like that, that were being um, unearthed or bought in in um, in the Andean area by German archaeologists. So there was a big collection and a huge resource for her to be able to look at that time. Now, since I'm not a weaver and know nothing about looping and twining and the endless variety of twists and turns that stitching can take, but um, the beauty of these things and the variety and the intricacy of what can be done within this grid-like pattern is really of interest. Um, there's endless possibilities for um, uh, there's a lot of language that goes with this about the density and the layering of weaving and things like that and directional things. I will show you this. So Joseph and Annie Albers met at the at the Bauhaus. This was an experimental school of art and design that flourished in Germany, um, um, basically brought together by uh, Walter Gropius, who was an architect, and um, he brought together a staff of the most extraordinary abstract artists in Europe, um, designers and painters. Uh, Kandinsky taught there, Paul Klee. Uh, it was really a who's who of the avant-garde in a certain way. Annie Albers was initially known as a textile artist, used the art of weaving both to make functional materials like draperies and upholstery and fabrics, and then to create one-of-a-kind wall hangings that functioned in a way that pure abstract painting does. She considered these abstractions to be visual resting places that provided a welcome diversion from the vicissitudes of everyday life. And you can see these early pieces. This was from 1925. Um, so I believe Annie uh, went to the Bauhaus in 1922. By um, by 1925, I believe she was teaching in the weaving workshop. Um, not exactly sure about those dates. Let me look for a second. Um, so Joseph went the year after it was founded, so 1921. Um, yeah, 1922. Um, so that the at this point the school is located in Berlin. Um, Annie and Joseph met at the school, knew each other for a few years, and married in 1925. Um, and eventually, she headed up the weaving department, but it's not giving me a date on that. Anyway, does not that relevant. Here they are. That shot is actually, they have a wonderful website, the Joseph and Annie Albers um, Foundation. It's a terrific website. Um, And this homage to square is one of Joseph Albert's pieces. His work is really about relational color, um, tone, and transparency. So you can, you know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Joseph right now. I think that both Joseph and Annie Albers deserve more than an hour of my time, but we're going to keep moving. And the primary items of clothing for men in ancient Peru were tunic, with or without sleeves. They had a vertical slit opening at the top for the neck. Considerable effort and time was invested in making elaborate tunics, since, in addition to being practical, among many groups, they were statements of ethnic affiliations, social status, and religious beliefs. Peruvian tunics displayed a great deal of variety in weaving techniques and patterns, and a wide range of color. This example, um, made in a slit tapestry technique with identical halves joined at the center and along the sides. It is bold in color and very unusual design. It its main pattern consists of two catfish with uh, spots, spotted zigzag bodies facing each other at the um, center line of the tunic. Their large heads have bicolored eyes, bared teeth, barblets, and fins. I included a Paul Klee here next to this piece. Klee taught design to the weavers in the workshop at the school, and in turn they influenced his work. Um, so really interesting. Okay. Paul Klee, who taught um, form to the Bauhaus weaving students, was Annie's god. She found him personally distant, often said that he reminded her of St. Christopher with the weight of Jesus on his shoulders, and said that on the one occasion when she and Joseph went to the Klee's house for a social visit, Paul and Louis Klee, he on violin, she on piano, played music by Bach and Mozart, and there was little conversation, but both Annie and Joseph considered him an unequaled genius. And you can see in this tunic from Peru the kind of complexity and kind of symbolic, abstract elements, really interesting stuff. And look at that up next to this Paul Klee, stylish ruins. You can see the kind of cryptic, symbolic language that was in both, and the kind of landscape elements and things like that. Okay. Women and the Bauhaus, weaving, and Annie Albers. Annie is down in the lower right-hand corner. Um, the women were guided into the weaving workshop. You know, it was kind of a, still a pretty macho deal here. Um, but the innovative approach that Annie took to weaving really embraced modernism and this kind of Andean um, tradition. They spent a lot of time at this ethnographic museum that was a great catalyst for their work. Um, so on the right we have an Annie Albers piece, and you can see the transparencies, these really subtle um, yellows mixed in with the gray. The tonal shift is so close. It's very it's a very active piece in certain ways. Let me see. Let me see if I can zoom in to some of this so that we can actually see some of this a little bit more clearly. And the rhythm that's set up by these pieces, you know, the placement of the yellow and tan rectangles playing off of the um the horizontal stripes of the black rectangles. It's a very active piece for something as subtle as it is. And then you can see this tunic, kind of a cue. Okay. And on the left is a wall hanging by Annie Albers. Um, it's quite big. It's 38 by, it's 93 by 38 inches. Um, and next to it is uh, basically an example of the thread that was used to create the actual wall hanging. And here is Annie with a student at Black Mountain College. So the deal here is in 1933, the Bauhaus closed. Um, the Nazis didn't have any use for avant-garde uh, uh, abstract painting, and so the school was closed. And being a um, Joseph married a wonderful artist who happened to be Jewish. The two of them knew that it was time to get out of town. So in 1933, Annie was out on the street, ran into Philip Johnson, who is, I think you probably have heard that name. He is a famous architect, American architect. And she invited him up to their apartment to show him the new white linoleum that they put in. She was very excited about it, and she invited him up for tea. And when she invited him up, he said, "Would you be interested in coming to America?" And without hesitation, she said, "Yes." And they actually um, I think it was the Rockefellers that paid for um, Joseph and Annie to come to America. Um, Almost immediately upon arrival in the United States, Joseph was offered a position teaching at Black Mountain College, which was a new experimental college that was opening up in Carolina, in North Carolina. Um, as soon as they heard the word experimental, they said yes. Um, so uh, they went, and Annie taught in actually they didn't have the looms at that point. She first taught um, weaving by having her students go out and and gather things from nature like seeds and twigs and leaves, various things, stones, whatever, and having them put together those textural elements in in um, in weaving pattern in woven patterns. I don't have examples of those. I wish I did. I did see some and didn't grab them at the time. Um, but the materiality of fabric is essential to um, her work. But one of the things that she was trying to do was have the students get that sense of combining textures. So different types of cloth, but different materials from nature can also be placed next to each other to give you that sense of texture and that sense of depth. Um, they loved America when they got here. They just had a great time. This is a beautiful piece from 1947. So they like I said, they landed here in 1933, I believe, and so they worked at um, Black Mountain College from 1933 until 1949, I believe it was. Um, they drove a lot. They loved to drive. In 1936, they made their first of, I think it was 17. I heard 14. I'm not sure how many trips they took to Mexico. And they loved it there. It was great inspiration for them both. The architecture, the people, the weavings, especially the basketry, all the elements, the pottery, um, all those patterns fit right in. Joseph was especially fond of the architecture and used that kind of architectonic shape as part of his work. Um, and here we have um, a tunic that was, I believe it was about um, 700, 800 AD, this tunic. And you can see this kind of uh, maze-like pattern that Annie adopted from the zigzag um, patterns of the Andean and actually um, Mesoamerican architecture. And here we have an beautiful Annie Albers hanging, and I put it up next to this mas- image of Machu Picchu, um, because I really saw a parallel between the structure of the temple and the structure within her tapestry. There's um, a vibrating quality to this fabric piece. The open loom, but also the details in. Let me see if I can do a close up on this. I'll zoom in for a minute and see what we can come up. Yeah. So you can see the intricacy of the patterns that are going on inside this thing. How you do this on a loom, I have absolutely no idea. Maybe some of you are more familiar with weaving than I, but it just is remarkable the kind of spontaneity that seems to be in this, but you have to be so methodical to make something like this happen and have it hold together properly. Okay. And in the show are um, Lenore Tomley um, uh, and Sheila Hicks. Um, some of them were actual students of Annie Albers. Um, all of them were influenced. Well, I can't imagine any fiber artist who is functioning today to not be influenced by Annie Albert's work. Um, and then, there's this wonderful embroidered bag. Uh, so these pieces are actually in the show in at the Met. And again, this is a Sheila Hicks on the left, and this kind of belt is was a actually a thing that they used for counting for if they were trying to figure out how many sheep or llamas or whatever were in the herd. They would separate out the strands if they were trying to count something. They would use this as a method. There were tons of these hats. I'm not sure how many of them are in the show, but these are in the collection of the Metropolitan. So I'm not sure how many of them are in the show, but again, the texture, the feel, the quality of the figure ground business that's going on in it, the shapes that are in these pieces are really wonderful. So again, I'm going to come back to this piece that I actually used for the flyer for this talk. This piece is a square inch out of this whole thing. Actually, let me do this. I'm going to zoom in and go over here and say this right here is the section that is over here in the detail. Um, See, this is only 14 by 15 and a half inches. So this is a square inch of this thing. And looking at this, looking at the intricacy of what she did in putting this together, how do you do that? This is a remarkable piece. The textures, the variation in directionality of the form within that very rigid structure of the grid. There is so much that she did with this, um, and the different qualities of the silk or the wool and the the textural feel of it and beautiful color. I think that's one of the things that Annie and Joseph shared was their love of of color and that pursuit. So by 1968, um, Annie was no longer able to weave she had arthritis and some, I can't remember what the degenerative um, thing was, but it takes a lot of physicality to do a loom, and you're it's really like a dance, you're moving constantly to make the thing happen. Um, but the red meander, this is what she did was she moved from um, uh, fabric into printmaking. And what this is basically she took a silk screen, created this meander, printed it, and then shifted the screen, or the printer shifted the screen and printed it again. And I'm gonna again zoom in so you can actually see the kind of subtle stuff that's going on with the layering. So again, she's weaving the print. So this business of transparency and translucency, she's using transparent ink, she's using, opaque ink, and playing back and forth, um, printing over and under. There's all kinds of things going on here. I have no idea how many screens went into it and all that, but um, I thought it was interesting to show you. Um, and okay, so this is from 1946. Wonderful piece. At first, it looks very simple. It's just some vertical lines on a field. Then you start to look at the piece for a little while and notice that the around the outside edges are smaller vertical lines. And in the center is this one large line. And she's creating a kind of depth by receding scale, by the smaller scale lines being on the exterior of this pattern, of this field. Now, that being said, take a good long look at that background. The herringbone pattern back there is going all over the place. It's going nuts. I am going to zoom in so that we can see this, because it is pretty amazing what's going on back there. And you start to see what she was up to. These herringbones in different directions throughout this piece. And you start to see the play off these lines and these different planes that are created by the different directions of that of that herringbone. Okay. These are miniature dresses from the 12th and 13th century, 8 by 8 inches, cotton and feathers. This is in the show also. Um, and look at them as just kind of abstract pieces. They're really beautiful. The texture, you know, the use of these beautiful, vibrant colors. Again, um, this kind of motif, quite wonderful. It's a, again, it's a tunic. Um, and here we have one of the other artists who's in the show, um, up next to a 17th century Peruvian tunic. And there's the landscape elements in both of them. Um, Olga especially talked about trying to integrate um, landscape into her weavings. Um, ah, and this is another um, the piece on the right is an Annie Albers gouache from 1928. The piece on the left is an Annie Albers um, serigraph, I believe, from I think it was 1979 or something like that. Um, and the reason I'm showing you these is I want to go here and show you this. Okay. And so again, we're back to Machu Picchu and temple and the how the elements of these architectural structures are in these pieces. And again, this is back to Olga. And I'm putting this here. The texture and structure of the grid is here again, but there's this organic quality to it. Um, I'm not sure what these are woven out of. I didn't catch that, but the piece um, the piece on the left is I'm especially sure is in the show at the Metropolitan, so we can find out then what exactly it's made of. Um, and here is a rug that was designed by Annie Albers in 1959. It was executed, I believe, in 1984. Um, and again, there's this weaving quality of that to that line, which we've seen in other pieces before. Again, it's this over under business that's going on throughout all these. The business of the grid is really something which is it's a soothing sort of matrix to work with. It's something that you can fight against it, you can use it in various ways, you can break it down, you can use it to reinforce things. It it's 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 a it's a meditative quality that it has. um, And then you come to something like this, where you've got this kind of freedom in her weaving that is remarkable. I mean, there's there's this layer of of spontaneity in these pieces. Um, and she did not draw these out completely. She did not um, uh, have have each fiber, each mark figured out. She was really an intuitive worker. How do you plan for the spontaneous? So this business of writing in the weaving, I'm it's something that Annie was very sensitive to in the Andean work. The idea of the mark making of this of of how the fibers were meshing, what the patterns were, what was going on with them. That was always something that she was very aware of. And this piece is kind of calligraphic. It's almost like a pulse. It's like uh, we're looking at a EKG, something along those lines. And this is late, 1962. So it was one of her late pieces. And again, um, beautiful, really zany sort of patterns. Again with the grid, but these wonderful figurative elements in these pieces, in these tapestries. And the piece on the left is a Sheila Hicks. I believe this is in the show. And look at the texture, look at the fabric itself, those the nuances of color throughout the piece. On the right is an Andean piece. And there's a whole series of these triadic pieces that Annie did in various color um, uh, dynamics. Some of them monochromatic, some of them two color. Um, but really interesting the use of the triangle and how many variations. Again, this is like weaving. How many variations can you have in a stitch? How much can you do with a very simple element repeated over and over again? And these are some of her etchings. And this is a installation shot. Um, and that's a Sheila Hicks piece over on the wall over there. And actually, this is one of the tunics that I showed you earlier in the presentation. There's a number of really good talk on Annie Albers on YouTube. There's also the Joseph and Annie Albers Foundation, which is well worth a visit. You can go to their website and they've got a lot of material on both of them. Um, and that is my talk for this week. So
That
thank you
was
all for coming.
Thank you, Larry. It was really very different. The whole,
Yeah,
well, the medium is so different, but it was
it
really
is.
interesting to see it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you all for coming. Have a good weekend. Tomorrow will be rain, but the day after is supposed to be nice. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks again.
Yes.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay.